And the reason we're doing this is because despite all of the law and order hype around the events last Thursday week in town, the riot that happened, we actually think that this is much, much deeper and much broader than a law and order issue. I mean, we've been involved most recently in a protest that was broken up quite violently and viciously by the Gardaí Síochána in the Debenhams occupation, and the amount of both equipment and personnel that the state was able to muster up to break up a protest by a group of women workers was just incredible. And to say that they couldn't have responded in equal measure to a racially motivated riot, we don't accept that. What we think has been happening, we believe has been happening, we can show it's been happening, is that the state has chosen to ignore the growth of fascist and far-right elements that have been stirring up racial hatred, that have been threatening library workers, closing down libraries as a consequence, that have been staging roadblocks at the airport and demanding to see people's passports, that have mounted buses and demanded to see identification from brown and black people, and that have literally threatened violence to burn out refugee centres. And that has been ignored. It has been dealt with kid gloves, and it has been fed into by the housing crisis in particular, but by all the multiple crises in our public sector, but particularly by the housing crisis, because we're seeing the highest levels of homelessness, particularly among families, and the message that they need to house the Irish first has run deep in this society. So the government's fuelled housing crisis, along with their attempt to ignore the growth of racism and the fascist far right, has led to this situation, and that's why we have no confidence in them. We don't believe that the Gardaí need water cannon or tasers or more weaponry. We believe that there has to be an attempt to deal with the question of the growth of racism and the far right by dealing with the fundamental issues that feed into it. And in particular, the housing crisis continues to do that. So we don't have confidence in the government, we don't have confidence in the Justice Minister or any of the ministers, and that's why we'll be voting against the government's confidence motion. No questions. Grant.
First of all, I just want to say that when you look at the absolutely freezing temperatures and the horrendous weather that we're facing now, the idea that people who have come here seeking international protection and asylum could be faced with the prospect of sleeping out in the streets with tents where it's not safe in freezing cold temperatures is really a shameful indication of failure of government policy. The idea that anybody could be sleeping on the streets, whether it is Ukrainian refugees, international protection applicants, or homeless people in this country, are all evidence of the government's failure to address the housing and accommodation crisis in this country. And we in particular think it is a failure on the part of the government to address the scandal of vast numbers of empty and vacant properties, often being sat on for speculative reasons by people making money out of property, and that they have failed to actually address this issue and bring those properties into use, which could actually provide accommodation for those that need it, whether it's homeless people, whether it's international protection applicants, whether it's Ukrainian refugees, is just an indication of a complete failure of policy on the part of the government, and an unwillingness really of the government to challenge property interests that are quite happy to sit on empty property as they watch the value of that property clock up. I also just want to say a word about comments made by the Taoiseach in relation to myself, which I just think are absolutely shameful comments, where he tried to suggest that somehow because I was being very strongly critical of the Israeli massacre in Gaza and described the behaviour of the Israeli state as being psychopathic, that somehow I was spreading bile or hatred, is a really shameful comment by the Taoiseach, when the people who we should be questioning are Western governments, including our own, that have failed to take any action whatsoever against an absolutely barbaric, savage, genocidal massacre that is being perpetrated by Israel in front of the eyes of the world of the population of Gaza. War crimes, crimes against humanity being committed right in front of our eyes, and the Taoiseach wants to criticise me for criticising what Israel is doing. I think it's absolutely shameful, but I suppose it's not surprising from a government that have refused point blank to take any action against Israel, and in the case of the Taoiseach, shamefully went on a propaganda tour meeting people like Netanyahu and other Israeli political leaders who were responsible for genocide in Gaza and for defending the illegal occupation, the siege of Gaza, and an apartheid regime that is fundamentally built on racism and the dehumanisation of Palestinians.
Richard, you also use the term filthy in relation to Israel, and some people have described that remark as anti-Semitic. Do you think in the current environment perhaps you should withdraw that remark, and in fact it has undermined some of what people might regard as legitimate criticisms of Israel?
I abhor every form of racism and anti-Semitism. And it is precisely because I oppose all forms of racism and have a long record of opposing racism and anti-Semitism that I think the regime of apartheid that Israel is defending is an absolutely disgusting, murderous, racist system. That should, in the same way as apartheid South Africa was dismantled, I believe this apartheid regime in Israel that is capable of the sort of crimes we are seeing perpetrated against the people of Gaza needs to be dismantled, and I make no apologies for it. Racism is a filthy ideology, and the apartheid system in Israel, just like the apartheid regime in South Africa, is a filthy racist regime.